Welcome back to the Grown Kid Talk Show, and after that PlayStation 5 event, my mind is blown. We got Final Fantasy 16 and God of War 2, just to name a few things. But before we get into today's video, definitely want to tell you that I did beat Greedfall, and I absolutely loved it. I just started the Technomancer, made by the same company, and have looked into Steel Rising, which is their new title that may be breaking that AA standard that they have set into AAA ground, and I'm actually really excited, especially for the lady who runs the company. She is really the definition of female empowerment and equality, so I think I'm going to be giving her her own video because she's really dope. In fact, she's probably someone Naughty Dog wishes they had on their team.
Are you out of your mind?
Just trying to make a point.
Also, I have started playing Watch Dogs 2. I might be going back to play Watch Dogs 1 because I do want to get acclimated with the series for Watch Dogs Legion. Final Fantasy 16 got revealed and nostalgic fans are pissed, and I'm absolutely loving it. I'm so glad that Square Enix went with this direction. They basically put the middle finger up to those fans who complained, them nostalgic ass Final Fantasy fans, and I just can't stop with the smiles and the happiness because I love the statement that they're making with this game. So hopefully I can bring a different angle to some things we're going to see and hear about Final Fantasy 16, but I'm just so excited. I want to thank Square Enix off the rip for not caving in to those nostalgic fans. I hope you enjoyed today's video.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, Grown Kid Talk Show. Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.
I want to start off by saying that every Final Fantasy fan has their own favorite Final Fantasy. There are many reasons why a specific Final Fantasy is your favorite. However, there are group consensus out there that do determine ranking systems. There are sales numbers to back people's certain opinions. There are tons of ways to decide what your favorite Final Fantasy is. I think one of the best things about Final Fantasy is that it is very much a Twilight Zone-esque type of thing. They do not have to follow a numbered, ordered sequence of a story to make great games. They can go off and do whatever they want. Now, again, everybody has their own favorite Final Fantasy, and after Final Fantasy 15, people got really vocal about what kind of Final Fantasy they wanted. Now, I'm not going to name names in this video because I do watch some of you guys out there making Final Fantasy videos. However, I will say that the consensus as a whole was that they wanted to return to more of their roots. Now, I do believe that this Final Fantasy 16 is a return to their roots, but not in the ways that people wanted it to be. For one, people really wanted it to be turn-based again. I don't know why they want turn-based, but I'm fucking glad we're not playing turn-based anymore. And I will say, if you want a turn-based Final Fantasy in the newer genre, play World of Fantasy. How I know you didn't play World of Fantasy? Because many people didn't play World of Fantasy, but it is a phenomenal Persona 5-esque turn-based game for the modern era that is really good. And if you hate on Final Fantasy 16, well then you should pray that they're working on World of Final Fantasy 2, because I really do want that game. Everyone has their own favorite Final Fantasy, so before you kill me, I want you to sit back and think about why you love your Final Fantasy. And one of the ways that we compare Final Fantasies is to its predecessors, usually the one right before it. There are clear Final Fantasy 15 similarities in the Final Fantasy 16 teaser. That is one of the Final Fantasies that was the most poorly received in recent memory. There were huge differences and upgrades to the games, and people had a hard time accepting it. And I'm going to start using the acronym here because I'm getting tongue-tied up. FF15 was in development hell, and it was all due to one guy. His name is Nomura. I do not want to hear your comparison for Final Fantasy 16 looking like Final Fantasy 14 because it's made by the same director. I don't want to hear that off the rip, and I'm already seeing pictures and videos about that. I want you to keep that same energy, Final Fantasy fans, when you're talking about 16. If you're gonna say something about it like that, then I want you to go back and say those same things in that same tone about other titles. And I am a huge fan of Final Fantasy 15. I was glad that they went in the direction of a play, of a drama. Things happen off screen and you have to kind of piece it together. Yeah, sometimes the world felt a little empty. I'm blaming more of the studio and the people who worked on the project before Tabata got there, because that was not a Tabata game. It became his game, so therefore he could be scapegoated, and I felt like Tabata felt that, and that is why he left the company. I feel bad for Tabata, but he turned a shit into a really good mainline Final Fantasy title that set the groundwork for the future. That is one thing I loved about Tabata, especially with his Type 0 series, which was an M-rated Final Fantasy, that he snuck in there as a mainline title, but nobody really seems to give it credit for it because it is numbered. It's called Type 0. So I really do think Tabata should be credited for this new direction, even though it's just in spirit. In design as well, Tabata still gets some credit here. That open world aspects, if you don't think Final Fantasy 16 is gonna be open world, it is. Let's not get it twisted, it is. What I'm going to compare it to is that Final Fantasy 16 looks a lot like the Omen trailer from Final Fantasy 15. It looks like we're gonna be getting that, a full dedicated commitment to that kind of storytelling that we should have gotten 15 had it not had to jump through so many hoops and development and the problems that it had to go to, especially with how it wanted to tell its story and the restrictions on that story and the things they wanted to show, that they definitely wanted to go a lot darker. However, some powers that be were not really allowing that. This Final Fantasy 16 may also be giving that middle finger to like a China. China is a really restrictive country controlling a lot of American media and other places of the world because we want to get into their market. I think this Final Fantasy 16 is going to be giving a finger to that. Hence all the blood we saw, the violence we saw. I really do, and I'm putting my prediction out there, that this is going to be an M-rated numbered Final Fantasy title mainline, which we have not seen the likes of. And one of the complaints again was there's no blood in Final Fantasy 7. That was kind of an opportunity to do that. Just keep imagining, what if I was able to get that, what they were trying to do with those Omen trailers in Final Fantasy 15, and I really believe that we're going to be getting that in 16. I mean, look at this blood here, and tell me how that doesn't scream M-rated to you. Especially now when censorship is at all-time high, when everything is just kind of crazy, and ratings are just all types of fucked up. I don't see how the game could just skate by anymore in that. And the one thing I also saw was, I saw Game of the Year potential, right? 15 didn't scream Game of the Year potential, but since now we have the VGAs, I think they want to go for that, the storytelling and everything, and or Project Athea. Now I'm going to bring up Athea as well, because Athea, if you look at the direction of that game, that is more action oriented, that is open world, and you're asking yourself, well, why all the open worldness? That open world stuff is not just because they want to appease a Western audience, it's because what they want to do. It would have been so easy for Final Fantasy 16 to say, we're going to make a turn-based game like Persona 5, and that be it. But where's the creativity in that? That's something that they know they can make, they can go back to, and it's designated for spin-off titles now. I'm not saying that turn-based can't make a comeback. I'm saying, do you really want to sit there into a loading screen for every battle? That adds a fake longness to the game. I sure as hell don't anymore. And in fact, if you were a developer, or I was a developer, or creatives everywhere, we have a picture in our mind we want to bring to life. The reason why Final Fantasy IX looked the way it did, and yes, I'm calling out Final Fantasy IX for having a lack of innovation. Why? Because Final Fantasy VIII was met with such resistance from Final Fantasy fans. I ask you to look at Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX and tell me which one looks the best. Well, you will come to the conclusion that it is Final Fantasy VIII. Why? Because they took more risks on that engine. They pushed the system to its limits. Final Fantasy VIII looks super, super good, but then you want to go to the chibi style in Final Fantasy IX. I don't like that. Now, I know everybody has their own favorite Final Fantasy, and I know you're just going to hate some of the things I'm saying, but I'm asking you to just take out your fandom for a second and ask yourself some of the questions I'm posing here. Which Final Fantasy looked better, 7, 8, or 9? Why? What was done? What changed? And I know I'm a little scattered here, and I'm just not really laying it out all well. And the next thing that Final Fantasy 15 laid the groundwork for, the game about the summons. I still believe to this day that Final Fantasy 15 had one of, if not the best, summons ever created in a Final Fantasy game. I love the way they look, and the main reason is that they gave them a human element. I want my summons to be more human-esque than creature-esque. Why? Because it adds for an interesting dynamic, and it's something we've always wanted as fans. Game really about the summons. You know, where Shiva, Ifrit, and Bahamut are in your party, and they are actually characters and not summons, and see how they become summons. I think that would be a really dope Final Fantasy titled game. But I do love this trend to keep giving these summons personalities and the love between Shiva and Ifrit, and I just love all of that stuff. Now I'm gonna tell you that they've done that before. Final Fantasy X, another game that is about the summons to an extent, right? You talk to Bahamut, the little kid. You know, the summons in Final Fantasy X were actually people. So the precedent was set before. It just was a little bit more covertly hidden, and it wasn't made a top priority in the story, even though in 10 it is arguable that it is a game about the summons and the faith and how they're so tired. But that still lends credence to the fact that 16 is very much going to have an aspect of the summons being a lot more important than going to fight a Doom train that is just like, ugh. People hated on 15, but I made a video way back in the day, one of my first, that Doom Train was actually in Final Fantasy 15, but it was done through metaphor and allegory. Now you can go check out that video, but I think what they were doing in 15 was really smart once Tabata was able to do it. And Yoshi P's no dummy either. There are reasons why there are similarities between how the character moves and how the character looks to some of his own designs in 14, and I think it's a slight nod, especially with Umbra, the little dog, to his good friend Tabata, who made Final Fantasy 15 and probably doesn't necessarily agree with what happened with him as a whole. People hated the combat in 15. Basically, they said it was too easy, and I've always challenged this idea. Yeah, it's too easy to pop 100 potions a battle, but you suck at the battle system. These nostalgic Final Fantasy fans just sucked so bad at the action combat of 15. They said it was terrible because they sucked at it. I myself took pride in being able to dodge and not use 25 potions every battle, right? There was a high skill ceiling to 15 that I don't think was given enough credit. Now again, I do like 15. Now if you don't, that's okay, but I ask you, why don't you like it? Because the answer can't be a lack of story, because we got a movie, we got an anime, we got a novella, and DLC all added in. Yes, correct. It wasn't just in my one copy of the game. I am a nostalgic Final Fantasy fan. I want one game, and that one game should have everything. This is not 1996, and if you want to go play Final Fantasy 4 or 5 again, be my guest, but the world doesn't. I'm sorry, but 15 brought in so many more new fans to replace some of those nostalgic fans that Square Enix said, fuck that. We're moving to the future, and that is what I'm so happy about. We're moving to the future. And before we get to the combat, I also want to bring up the topic of time jumps. We see our main character younger, and then we see them older. Surprisingly similar to when Noxus went to sleep for 10 years, I believe. I am so glad that at this time we're going to see that whole story and that gap filled in a lot better, like we should have in 15. That was always intended to be. So again, the influences, the groundwork that 15 laid for the future of Final Fantasy, which I was always holding fast onto. I was there saying that I want this, I want them to keep doing this. Yeah, the open world might feel empty, but they're gonna get it right. Why? Because this is the first time they've really attempted the next gen open world type of thing in Final Fantasy, and you have to give them a chance. But the fans, the nostalgic fans, tried to kill 15 and say that Final Fantasy returned to its roots. The only roots that it's returning to is the idea of the rustic, non-mechanical machina type of world. You know, where there's peasants, lords, and kings, but there's no, like, machines. It was stated, and I actually think it might have been Yoshi P who said it, that he wants to return to that kind of world again, where there's no machina and stuff like that. So they're doing that. Those are roots. That's Final Fantasy 1, 2, and like 3. So with the combat being the way it is, the fluid, people are calling it a shadow step, and the one-to-one combat making monsters feel a lot stronger. Like, you're not just going to be running to the field and brainlessly pressing X and then pressing item. and then watching it do 45 damage, and then popping an antidote for your other party member. Fuck the other party members, you only need one. And I love that idea. You know why? Because people really didn't like Final Fantasy 13, but Final Fantasy 13 did try a few different things. It had a huge party in the first game. Then that huge party got cut down to like 2 characters. 2. And then in the third game, it got cut down to 1 character. 1. I repeat, 1 character. Now, people say that Final Fantasy 13-2 and Final Fantasy 13-3 are better than the original Final Fantasy 13. Then these nostalgic fans are going to go complain about 4 characters in Final Fantasy 15, which I actually like, and then no women in the game, which is just a bullshit-ass complaint, because obviously Final Fantasy 13 was a trilogy about a woman. So I don't want to hear that complaint at all. If it's a fucking male, take your bullshit elsewhere and go watch the beginning of my video when I said there are actually dope women doing really dope shit that, hey, maybe give them some fucking credit and praise instead of trying to tear everything down. But now this Final Fantasy 16 is giving off the aura of just 1 character, and I'm kind of okay with that, honestly. I really think that the focus of telling a 1 character Final Fantasy could be really dope, and again, not really happened in the mainline title. I'm not going to count the trilogy of 13 in that mainline title because it goes 12, 13, 14, 15. We as Final Fantasy fans like to count the 1, and I'm really just excited for this 1 character, 1 Final Fantasy, 1 story. So I'm gonna kind of close the video off. I know I just kind of rambled and talked and grabbed, and hopefully you could follow a little bit. I'm gonna end it off with saying fuck those nostalgic Final Fantasy fans. And the one thing I could always say is that everybody has an idea for what kind of Final Fantasy they want, but if you ask them what kind of Final Fantasy they would make, they actually have no clue. But they will just kill anything that isn't their nostalgic or their favorite Final Fantasy, and that's the real shame here. And I'm glad Square Enix said fuck that. This is the future, we're moving on. This is what is in our head that we're going to bring to life. There are no more limitations of the system or technology. I cannot wait for this game, Final Fantasy 16. My hope and my estimation that this is a M-rated game, and we will get this right after Project Athia. And again, look at Project Athia, that open world, 1 character, female. As of right now, who knows what else we'll get in Final Fantasy. It is Final Fantasy. Probably will be some other companions there. It is Final Fantasy 16 going in a new direction, and I couldn't be happier. I'm the grown kid. I know I talked a lot. I know I rambled. I didn't rant. I was just so happy. I'll catch you back in another video.
Yo, it's the Grown Kid Talk Show.